Smoke still clung to the mountain when they carried him in. Blood soaked through the wrapping on his side, and his breathing came in short, broken pulls. 4 guards struggled to hold him steady as they moved through the narrow stone hall, their boots slipping on the wet floor. Cain Ashgrove, the Alpha King of the Northern Territory, had led his warriors against the Draven Pack that night, and though he had won the ground, the price had nearly taken his life. The healer's den sat far below the main hall, carved into the rock where sound could not travel, and secrets could not escape. A young woman named Wren stood near the stone basin, already rolling clean linen into strips, already boiling water over a low flame. She had heard the horn blast an hour earlier, the signal that wounded were coming, and she had not stopped moving since. When the guards brought him through the door, she did not look at his face first. She never did. It was forbidden, and she had learned long ago not to break that rule even for a moment. Her eyes went straight to the wound instead, to the deep gash along his ribs, to the dark bruising spreading across his shoulder, to the way his breath caught every time his chest rose. "Lay him on the table," she said, her voice calm despite the urgency crawling under her skin. "Gently. Watch the left side." The guards obeyed without question. Everyone in the pack knew the rule of the healer's den. The one who served the Alpha King in secret worked without a face, without a name spoken aloud, without eyes meeting his. It was a tradition older than Cain himself, meant to protect the healers from being used as targets by rival packs. If no one knew who tended the king's wounds, no one could threaten her to reach him. Wren pulled the veil down further over her face, the thin dark cloth falling just below her eyes, and began to work. Cain's body was already fighting to heal itself. His wolf blood gave him strength beyond any ordinary man, but even a king's body had limits, and tonight he had pushed far past them. His skin was slick with sweat and blood, his jaw clenched tight against pain he refused to voice aloud. When her hands first touched the wound at his side, his whole body flinched, and a low growl rumbled from somewhere deep in his chest, more animal than man. Wren did not step back. She had heard that sound before from other wounded wolves, and she understood it was not a warning meant for her. It was pain speaking the only language his wolf knew. "You're safe," she whispered, keeping her voice low and even. "Let me help you." His eyes were closed, lashes dark against his pale skin, but at the sound of her voice, something in his shoulders loosened, just slightly, just enough for her to notice. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with a mixture of crushed herbs and boiled water. Watching as the mixture bubbled faintly against torn skin, he hissed through his teeth, his hand curling into a fist at his side, but he did not pull away. She pressed a cloth soaked in medicine directly against the gash, and his whole body went rigid. "I know," she murmured. "I know it hurts. It will pass soon." The wolf inside him seemed to understand her tone even if his conscious mind was slipping in and out of awareness. His breathing slowed by a fraction, his clenched jaw eased. When her fingers brushed lightly against his uninjured arm to steady him, something strange passed between them, a current neither could name, quiet and electric, like a memory neither of them had lived yet. Cain's eyes opened halfway, unfocused, glassy with pain and exhaustion. He could not see her face in the dim candlelight, only the outline of her form bent over him, only the veil covering everything from her nose down. But he felt her, not just her hands. Something deeper, something his wolf recognized even though his mind could not place it. "Who?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you?" "Someone doing her duty," Wren answered softly, not meeting his eyes even now. "Rest, my king. You need your strength." He wanted to argue. He wanted to ask again, to demand an answer the way he demanded answers from everyone else in his territory. But darkness pulled at the edges of his vision, and his body, exhausted from battle and blood loss, finally gave in. His head fell back against the table, and his breathing evened out into something closer to sleep. Wren exhaled slowly, only then realizing how tightly she had been holding her own breath. She continued her work in silence, stitching the deepest part of the wound with careful, practiced hands, applying salve to the bruises along his ribs, wrapping fresh linen around his torso. The whole time she kept her eyes low, her face angled away from his, even though his eyes were closed, and he could not have seen her regardless. It was habit. It was survival. It was the only way she knew how to exist in this world. Hours passed. The candle burned low, wax pooling at its base, shadows stretching long across the stone walls. Wren sat beside him on a low stool, checking his pulse every so often, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead when fever tried to creep in. His wolf stirred occasionally in his sleep, low sounds rumbling from his chest, restless and searching. As though even unconscious, some part of him reached for something just out of grasp. At one point his hand moved without his knowing it, fingers brushing against hers where she held the cloth to his brow. Ren froze, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. She should have pulled away. Every rule she had ever been taught told her to pull away immediately. Instead, she stayed still, letting his fingers rest against hers for one long moment, before gently sliding her hand free. She told herself it meant nothing. He was in pain, half-conscious, seeking comfort the way anyone might. It was not recognition. It could not be recognition. But something inside her, some quiet certainty she had spent years trying to bury, whispered otherwise. Ren had grown up hearing stories about mates, about the invisible pull between two souls chosen by fate, about how a wolf could sense its match through scent and touch long before the mind understood what was happening. She had always assumed those stories were not meant for her. Her family carried a shadow over their name, a disgrace from years before she was even born, and daughters of disgraced bloodlines were not meant to dream of kings. She pushed the thought away and focused on her work instead. By the time morning light began to creep faintly through the small window carved high in the stone wall, Kane's breathing had steadied into something strong and even. His fever had broken sometime before dawn, and the wound along his side, though still raw, had closed enough that Ren no longer feared infection taking hold. She checked his bandages one final time, adjusted the blanket over him, and gathered her supplies quietly, preparing to leave before he woke. She was almost at the door when his voice stopped her, rough with sleep, but clearer than it had been hours before. "Wait." Ren froze, her hand resting against the wooden frame. She did not turn around. "You saved my life," he said, and even without seeing his face, she could hear something in his voice she had not expected. Not command, not the tone of a king used to obedience, something quieter, something almost vulnerable. "It was my duty," she answered simply. "Will I know your name?" "No," she said, and the word came out steadier than she felt. "That is not permitted." There was a pause, long enough that she thought perhaps he had drifted back to sleep. Then he spoke again, softer this time. "My wolf knows something," he murmured, almost to himself. "Even if I do not." Ren's fingers tightened against the doorframe. She did not answer. She could not trust her own voice in that moment, could not risk him hearing something in it that she was not ready to reveal, not to him, not to anyone. "Rest, my king," she said instead, and slipped out of the room before he could speak again. The heavy door closed behind her with a soft click, and Ren stood alone in the narrow stone corridor, her heart pounding harder than it had any right to. She pressed her palm flat against the cool stone wall, steadying herself, trying to slow the rush of feeling threatening to spill over. It was nothing, she told herself again. He was wounded and confused, speaking words that meant nothing beyond the fog of pain and medicine. By tomorrow, he would not even remember her voice, let alone the strange warmth that had passed between them in the dark. She did not yet know that Kane's wolf did not forget so easily. Inside the room, Kane lay still, staring up at the low stone ceiling, his mind turning over the fading scent that lingered in the air. Something soft, something like crushed herbs mixed with rain. It should have meant nothing to him. He had been tended by healers before, always hidden, always nameless, and he had never once given it a second thought. But tonight was different. His wolf paced beneath his skin, restless in a way it had never been before, circling around a single thought it refused to let go of. Somewhere in that darkness, hands unseen and a voice barely above a whisper, something had shifted inside him, some quiet recognition too deep for words. He closed his eyes again, but sleep did not come easily this time. Instead, he found himself replaying every second of the encounter, the sound of her breathing, the careful precision of her hands, the brief warmth of her fingers against his. He did not know her face, he did not know her name, but some part of him, the oldest and most instinctive part, already understood one thing with startling certainty. He would find her again. Whether tradition allowed it or not, whether the healer's den kept its secrets locked away as it always had, Kane Ashgrove knew, somewhere deep in the part of himself that was more wolf than man, that this was not the end of whatever had just begun between them in the dark. It was only the beginning. Down the winding stairs, far from the healer's den, Ren returned to the small quarters she kept near the edge of the pack grounds, away from the main hall where most of the healers lived. She had chosen that distance herself years ago, when she first understood what her family name meant to the people around her. Better to stay unseen than to be watched with suspicion every time she walked past. She set her supplies down on the wooden table and sank onto the edge of her narrow bed, finally allowing her shoulders to drop from the tension she had carried all night. Her hands still trembled faintly, though whether from exhaustion or something else entirely, she did not want to examine too closely. Her grandmother had once told her stories about the old healers, about how their entire purpose was built on invisibility. A healer who could not be seen could not be threatened. A healer with no name could not be used as leverage against the king. It was meant to be protection, and for most of her life, Ren had accepted that reasoning without question. But tonight, for the first time, the veil had felt less like protection, and more like a wall keeping her from something she could not name. She thought of Kane's hand brushing against hers, the way his fingers had curled slightly before slipping away, the low rumble that had risen from his chest when pain overtook him. She thought of the strange, quiet steadiness that had settled over her the moment she touched his skin, as though her whole body already understood something her mind refused to accept. It could not be what she feared it was. It could not be that simple, that impossible, that dangerous. Her family's name had been stripped of honor 2 generations before she was born, when her grandfather had been accused of betraying pack secrets to a rival territory. Whether the accusation had been true or false no longer mattered. The shame had settled over her family like a permanent shadow, and no one born into that bloodline was permitted to rise above the lowest ranks of service. Healers from her family were allowed to work, quietly and without recognition, precisely because their skill was needed, and their silence could be guaranteed. If anyone discovered that the healer who had tended the Alpha King through the night carried that same disgraced blood, it would not matter how gentle her hands had been or how many lives she had saved in the years since. The scandal alone would be enough to end everything she had built for herself in the shadows. She pressed her palms against her eyes and exhaled slowly, willing the tightness in her chest to ease. It was foolish to worry over one strange moment in a healer's den. Kings recovered from wounds and grew stronger, and stronger men rarely remembered the quiet hands that had helped them through their weakest hours. By the time the sun rose fully over the mountain, he would likely have already forgotten the sound of her voice. She told herself this until her breathing slowed, until sleep finally began to pull at the edges of her exhausted mind. She did not know, as she drifted off, that somewhere above her, in the king's private chamber, sleep was proving far more difficult to find. Kane lay awake long after Ren had gone, staring at the stone ceiling as the first gray light of morning crept through the narrow window. His wound had closed, his strength was returning steadily with each passing hour, but his mind refused to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, the memory returned, unbidden and insistent, the scent of crushed herbs and rain, the low murmur of a voice trying to soothe him through pain, the brief warmth of unfamiliar fingers against his own. His beta, a steady and loyal wolf named Colin, arrived not long after sunrise to check on him, and found the king sitting upright already, far earlier than his healing should have allowed. "You should be resting," Colin said, frowning as he studied the bandages still wrapped tightly around Kane's ribs. "The healer said your body needs time." "I have rested," Kane replied, though the shadows beneath his eyes told a different story. "Tell me something, Colin. The healer who tended me last night. Do you know her?" Colin's expression shifted immediately, careful and guarded. "You know the tradition, my king. No one has told the healer's identity, not even you." "I am aware of the tradition," Kane said, his voice edged with something sharper than simple curiosity. "I am asking if you know." "I do not," Colin answered honestly. "Only the eldest healers keep that knowledge, and they guard it closely. It has always been that way, long before either of us were born." Kane said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tightening as he stared past his beta toward the narrow window and the pale light beyond it. Colin, who had served beside him since childhood and knew every shift in his king's temperament, studied him carefully. "You seem troubled by this," Colin said slowly. "More troubled than a king usually is by a nameless healer's hands." "My wolf recognized her," Kane admitted quietly, the words feeling strange and heavy as he spoke them aloud for the first time. "Not fully, not completely. But something in me knew her, Colin. I have never felt anything like it before." Colin's frown deepened, concern flickering behind his steady gaze. "That is not something to say lightly, my king. If your wolf has marked her as something more, tradition or not, it will not simply fade with time. You know this as well as I do." "I know," Kane murmured, his hand pressing lightly against the bandage at his side, feeling the faint pull of the healing wound beneath it. "Which is why I intend to find her." "The healers guard their identities carefully," Colin warned. "Breaking that tradition could unsettle the elders. They will not welcome questions, especially not from you." "I do not care what unsettles the elders," Kane said, his voice low and certain in a way that left no room for argument. "My wolf has never reacted to anyone the way it reacted to her last night. I will not simply let that go because tradition tells me to look away." Colin studied his king for a long moment, weighing the determination in his voice, the rare vulnerability beneath the usual command of his tone. Finally, he nodded once, though the worry in his eyes did not fully disappear. "Then be careful," Colin said quietly. "Whoever she is, if the elders sense you searching, they will move quickly to keep her hidden. And if there is a reason she has stayed hidden all this time, it may not be one you expect." Cain did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the narrow window once more, watching the pale morning light spread slowly across the stone floor, thinking of a voice he could not place and a touch he could not forget. Whatever reason lay behind the silence surrounding her, he intended to uncover it. His wolf demanded nothing less. 3 days passed before Cain could walk without pain pulling sharply at his side, and even then, the healers who checked on him during that time were always different from the one who had tended him that first night. Young apprentices came and went, changing his bandages, checking his fever, never lingering long enough for him to study their voices or catch a familiar scent. He asked each of them, carefully at first and then more directly, whether they knew who had treated him when he first arrived. Every answer was the same. No one knew, or no one was willing to say. By the 4th day, restlessness had settled so deeply into him that even his closest advisors noticed the shift in his mood. He paced through the halls of his stone fortress at hours when he should have been resting, his wolf pushing constantly beneath his skin, agitated and searching, unwilling to settle into the quiet stillness it usually found after a battle had ended and wounds had healed. Edmund, the eldest of the pack elders, requested an audience with him on the 5th morning, his expression carrying the particular weight of someone who had already heard rumors he did not like. "You have been asking questions," Edmund said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Cain's desk, his silver hair catching the pale light filtering through the window. "About the healer who tended you." "I have," Cain admitted, not bothering to deny it. There was little point in pretending otherwise with a man who had served 3 generations of Alpha Kings and had learned to read every shift in temperament long before it became obvious to anyone else. "You understand why the tradition exists," Edmund said carefully. "It was put in place after the war with the Eastern Pacts, when healers who tended wounded alphas were hunted and killed to weaken the bloodline. Anonymity keeps them safe. It keeps you safe as well, my king. An enemy cannot threaten what he cannot identify." "I am not asking because I doubt the tradition's purpose," Cain said, leaning forward slightly, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. "I am asking because my wolf will not let this go, Edmund. Something happened in that room, something I cannot explain, and will not pretend away simply because it is inconvenient." Edmund studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, something that looked almost like recognition of his own. "Mates are rare," Edmund said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. "Rarer still is a recognition that's strong from a single night of contact, especially through injury and exhaustion. If your wolf has truly marked her, it is not something that will fade with time or distraction. I have seen it happen before, though not often, and never without consequence." "Then help me," Cain said. "Tell me how to find her." "I did not say I would help you," Edmund replied, his tone sharpening slightly. "I said I understood the weight of what you are describing. That is not the same as agreeing to break tradition that has protected healers for generations. If word spreads that the king is searching for a specific healer by scent alone, every healer in this territory becomes a target for anyone hoping to gain your favor by claiming to be her, or worse, anyone hoping to harm whoever she truly is before you can protect her." Cain's jaw tightened at that, the truth of it settling uncomfortably in his chest. He had not considered how his search itself might create danger where none had existed before. "Then what do you suggest?" Cain asked. "That I simply forget this happened?" "I suggest patience," Edmund said. "If your wolf has truly recognized her, fate has a way of closing distances that stubbornness cannot. Force this, and you may frighten her into hiding herself so completely that you never find her at all. Let it unfold naturally, and you may discover the truth sooner than you expect." Cain did not entirely trust the wisdom of waiting, not with the restless pull his wolf exerted every hour of every day, but he recognized the sense in Edmund's caution nonetheless. He nodded once, though the tightness in his shoulders did not ease. Over the following days, Cain found himself inventing reasons to visit the healer's den, though he told himself each time that his motives were purely practical. A lingering ache in his ribs that required checking, a headache that would not fade, a shallow cut on his palm from training that needed cleaning, though it was barely deep enough to notice. Each time, he was tended by different apprentices, young healers with steady hands but none of them carrying the scent he searched for. None of them speaking with the low, calming voice that still echoed through his memory at odd hours of the day. He began to notice patterns instead, small details that told him more than direct questions ever could. The apprentices spoke of an older healer among them, with a certain hushed respect, someone who worked mostly at night, someone whose name was never mentioned aloud in his presence. When he asked one young apprentice directly about her, the girl's eyes widened with visible alarm before she quickly excused herself from the room, claiming she was needed elsewhere. It was enough to confirm what he already suspected. The healer who had tended him existed, was known among her peers, and was being carefully protected from his questions. His wolf, far from being satisfied by this confirmation, only grew more restless. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the battle that had nearly taken his life, Cain found himself walking the lower corridors near the healer's den, long after most of the fortress had gone quiet for the night. He told himself he was simply restless, unable to sleep, in need of movement to settle his mind, but some part of him knew the truth of where his feet were carrying him even before he admitted it to himself. The corridor near the den was dim, lit only by a few scattered candles set into wall sconces, throwing long shadows across the stone floor. He heard voices ahead, low and hushed, coming from behind a partially closed door. He slowed his steps, careful not to announce his presence, and found himself listening, despite every instinct telling him it was improper for a king to eavesdrop on his own healers. "She has not slept properly in days," one voice said, young and concerned. "Ever since that night with the king, she has barely spoken to anyone." "She is frightened," another voice answered, older, weary. "You know what discovery would mean for her. For her whole family. But surely the king does not suspect her specifically. There are a dozen healers who could have tended him that night. He does not need to suspect her specifically," the older voice said. "He only needs to keep searching long enough, and eventually the truth surfaces on its own. Fate has a way of doing that, whether we wish it to or not." Cain stood frozen in the shadows, his heart beating faster than it had any right to at simply overhearing a conversation. Frightened. Her whole family. The words circled through his mind, catching on details he could not yet piece together into a full picture, but which told him enough to know that whoever this healer was, her silence was not born from mere tradition alone. Something deeper was at stake for her, something personal enough to keep her hidden even now, weeks after tending his wounds. He wanted to step forward, to demand answers directly, but something held him back. Perhaps it was Edmund's warning echoing in his mind, or perhaps it was simple instinct telling him that forcing this moment would only push her further away. Instead, he stood silently in the shadows until the voices fell quiet, and footsteps moved further into the den, and then he turned and walked back through the corridor the way he had come, his mind churning with questions that refused to settle. That night, sleep came slowly and uneasily, filled with half-formed images of a veiled face he could not quite bring into focus, and a voice he could not stop hearing even in the depths of his dreams. His wolf paced restlessly through those dreams as well, circling always around the same absence, the same unfinished recognition, refusing to let the matter rest no matter how deeply exhaustion pulled at him. He woke before dawn with a single thought settled firmly in his mind, clearer than anything had been in the 2 weeks since the battle. Whatever fear kept her hidden, whatever shadow from her past made her believe she needed to remain unseen, he intended to prove to her, eventually, that she had nothing to fear from him. His wolf had chosen her, and Cain Ashgrove did not intend to let tradition, fear, or silence stand permanently in the way of whatever his wolf already understood to be true. Wren had not slept a full night since the day she treated the Alpha King, and the weight of that exhaustion had begun to show in the faint shadows beneath her eyes, and the way her hands sometimes trembled when she reached for her instruments. She told herself it was simply fatigue from the long hours she kept, but the truth sat heavier in her chest than any amount of missed sleep could explain. News traveled quickly through the healer's den, even when it was meant to stay contained. Within days, whispers had spread among the apprentices that the king himself had been asking questions, searching for the healer who tended him that first night, his wolf apparently unwilling to let the matter rest. Wren heard these whispers secondhand, delivered in hushed tones by younger healers who had no idea the subject of their gossip sat quietly among them, mixing salves with steady hands and a carefully composed expression. Illyra, the eldest healer in the den, and the woman who had trained Wren since she was young enough to barely reach the healing table, noticed the change in her almost immediately. She said nothing at first, simply watching with the quiet patience of someone who had spent decades reading pain and fear in the smallest details of a person's posture. But on the 4th evening after the rumors began circulating, she finally pulled Wren aside into the small storage room where dried herbs hung in neat rows from the low ceiling. "You have not been yourself," Illyra said quietly, closing the door behind them to ensure privacy. "I know it was you who tended him that night. I do not need you to confirm it. I have known you long enough to see the truth in the way you flinch every time his name is mentioned." Wren's shoulders tensed, but she did not bother denying it. There was little point in lying to the one person who had protected her secret since childhood, who had taken her in when her own family's disgrace made her unwelcome in the higher circles of the den. He does not know, Ren said quietly, and he cannot know. If word reaches him, reaches anyone, about who I truly am. I understand the danger better than most, Alira interrupted gently. I was the one who convinced the council to let you train here despite your bloodline, remember? I have carried that risk alongside you for years. But Ren, if your wolf has recognized his, and his wolf has recognized yours, this is not something that will simply fade because you wish it to. I do not know that it has, Ren said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. She had felt something in that room, something she had spent years convincing herself did not exist for someone like her. Someone born into shame she had not chosen and could not escape. Then you must decide what frightens you more, Alira said, her voice softening further. The possibility that fate has chosen you for something greater than the shadow your family carries, or the certainty of remaining hidden forever out of fear that greatness was never meant for someone like you. Ren did not have an answer for that, not one she was ready to speak aloud, and Alira did not press further. Instead, the older woman simply rested a weathered hand on her shoulder for a brief moment before returning to her duties, leaving Ren alone among the hanging herbs with thoughts she could not quiet. 2 days later, Ren was summoned to deliver a shipment of prepared medicines to the upper storage rooms near the main hall, a task she had performed countless times without incident. She carried the wooden crate carefully through the familiar corridors, her steps quiet and practiced, her mind occupied with the list of herbs she still needed to gather before nightfall. She rounded a corner near the western stairwell and stopped abruptly, her heart lurching painfully in her chest. Kane stood only a short distance away, speaking quietly with one of his guards, his broad shoulders angled toward the window where afternoon light spilled across the stone floor. He had not yet noticed her. She had perhaps 3 seconds to retreat before he turned and saw her standing there, crate balanced awkwardly in her arms, veil pulled carefully over the lower half of her face as always. Her feet refused to move for a moment, frozen by something she could not name, some instinct pulling her forward, even as every rational thought screamed at her to retreat. Then Kane's head turned slightly, as though some part of him had sensed a presence before his eyes confirmed it, and Ren stepped quickly back around the corner, pressing herself flat against the cold stone wall, her breath coming in short, careful pulls. She heard his voice pause mid-sentence, heard silence stretch for a beat longer than it should have. Her pulse pounded so loudly in her own ears that she wondered if he could somehow hear it from where he stood. "Is something wrong, my king?" the guard's voice asked, curious. There was a pause before Kane answered, his voice carrying an edge of distraction that had not been there moments before. "No, it is nothing. A scent on the wind, perhaps." Ren did not wait to hear more. She turned and hurried back the way she had come, taking a longer route through a service corridor rarely used by anyone outside the healer's staff, her heart still hammering long after she had put considerable distance between herself and the western stairwell. She did not stop moving until she reached the safety of the den itself, setting the crate down with hands that trembled more than she wanted to admit. That night, she lay awake long after the candles had burned low, staring at the low stone ceiling above her narrow bed, replaying the moment his head had turned, the way his voice had faltered mid-sentence, as though something invisible had tugged at his attention. "A scent on the wind," he had said. Not knowing, not certain, but sensing something all the same. She pressed a hand against her own chest, feeling her heart still beating faster than it should, and wondered, not for the first time, how long she could continue avoiding a fate that seemed determined to find her, regardless of how carefully she hid. Her grandmother's disgrace had shaped every choice Ren had made since childhood, every quiet retreat into invisibility, every careful avoidance of attention or recognition. She had built her entire existence around the belief that safety meant remaining unseen, that ambition and visibility were luxuries reserved for those without shameful bloodlines trailing behind them like a shadow no distance could outrun. But lying there in the darkness, feeling the echo of a near encounter still humming beneath her skin, Ren found herself questioning, for the first time in years, whether the walls she had built to protect herself were truly keeping her safe, or simply keeping her small. She did not have an answer that night, but she understood, with a growing sense of unease she could not shake, that whatever her wolf had recognized in that healer's den weeks ago was not something that intended to remain quiet for much longer. Somewhere above her, in the king's private chamber, Kane stood by his window long after the guard had gone, staring out at the darkened grounds below, his wolf restless beneath his skin, in a way that had become achingly familiar over the past weeks. He had not seen her face, he still did not know her name, But for one fleeting moment in that corridor, he had felt something pull sharply at his attention. Some instinct older than reason itself insisting that she had been close. Close enough to sense. Close enough that his wolf had nearly forced him to turn and search the shadows for her presence. He did not know how much longer he could continue circling this mystery without answers. But he understood, standing there in the quiet darkness of his chamber, that whatever force had connected them in that healer's den was growing stronger with each passing day, not weaker, and that fate, as Edmund had suggested, seemed determined to close the distance between them, whether either of them was fully ready for it or not. A gathering had been called for the following week, a tradition observed twice each year, when the Northern Territory welcomed representatives from allied packs to renew agreements and settle disputes before they could grow into conflict. It was the largest event held within the fortress walls, drawing wolves from every corner of the territory, and preparations for it consumed the entire household in the days leading up to it. Alira called Wren into her small office on the morning the announcement reached the den, her expression carrying a weight that told Wren immediately this was not an ordinary assignment. The council has requested healers attend the gathering directly, in the open hall, rather than remaining hidden in the den as usual, Alira said, watching Wren's reaction carefully as she spoke. Injuries happen often enough during the sparring exhibitions and the feasting that follows. It has become tradition in recent years to have healers present among the crowd, rather than summoned separately each time. Wren felt her stomach tighten immediately. Present among the crowd, without veils. Without veils, Alira confirmed quietly. The council has always made an exception for gatherings. Only the king's private wounds are tended in secret. Public injuries during a public event are treated openly, as they always have been. I cannot attend, Wren said, the words leaving her before she had fully considered them. Surely there are other healers who can be assigned instead. There are, Alira agreed. But you are among the most skilled we have, and the council has specifically requested our most capable healers be present, given the size of this gathering. Refusing without explanation would draw more attention to you than simply attending quietly ever could. Wren pressed her palms flat against the wooden desk between them, steadying herself against the sudden rush of panic threatening to close her throat. She had spent years perfecting the art of remaining unseen, and now, within the space of a single conversation, that careful invisibility was being stripped away by simple necessity. He will be there, Wren said quietly. The king. He attends every gathering. He does, Alira said, not bothering to soften the truth. And if your wolf truly recognized his in that healer's den, standing in the same hall without a veil covering your face may be exactly what fate intends. I cannot protect you from that, Wren. I can only tell you that hiding from it forever was never going to be a choice you were permitted to keep. Wren said nothing for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them offering the reassurance she desperately wanted. She could plead illness, though such an excuse would only delay the inevitable and might draw suspicion from a council already stretched thin with preparations. She could request reassignment to duties elsewhere in the fortress, though healers of her skill were rarely permitted such flexibility during events as significant as the gathering. In the end, she understood, standing there in Alira's small office with dried herbs hanging from the ceiling above them, that there was no path forward that did not eventually lead to this moment. She would stand in that hall, unveiled, among hundreds of wolves from across the territory, and whatever recognition Kane's wolf carried toward her would finally have the chance to complete itself in the light rather than the shadows. The thought terrified her more than she wanted to admit. Elsewhere in the fortress, preparations for the gathering continued at a steady, purposeful pace. Guards reinforced the perimeter walls, kitchen staff prepared stores of food sufficient to feed hundreds of guests, and the great hall itself was cleaned and decorated with banners representing each allied pack expected to attend. Among those expected was Garrick Voss, alpha of the Eastern Border Pack, a wolf whose ambition had grown considerably in recent years alongside his territory's expanding influence. Garrick had long viewed Kane's position as one he believed himself equally, if not better, suited to hold, though he had never found sufficient cause or opportunity to challenge that belief openly. The gathering, with its formal exchanges of respect and subtle displays of strength, offered him another opportunity to measure himself against the king he quietly resented. Colin mentioned Garrick's expected attendance to Kane during one of their morning meetings, watching carefully for his king's reaction. He will bring his usual entourage, Colin said, reviewing the list of arriving delegations, and likely his usual attempts to needle you during the formal exchanges. He has never accepted your claim to the Northern Territory gracefully, even after all these years. Garrick's opinion of my claim has never troubled me, Kane replied, Though his attention seemed only partially focused on the conversation, his mind still occupied by thoughts that had consumed him for weeks now. Colin studied him for a moment before setting the parchment aside entirely. "You are still thinking of her." "I cannot seem to stop," Kane admitted, the confession feeling strange even as he spoke it aloud to the one person who had earned his complete trust over the years. "Every hour that passes without answers only deepens whatever this is. My wolf grows more restless, not less." "The healers will be present at the gathering," Colin said carefully. "Unveiled, as is tradition during such events. If she is among them, you may finally have the chance to see what your wolf has been searching for all this time." Kane's gaze sharpened immediately at that information, something in his chest tightening with a mixture of anticipation and unease he had not expected to feel. "You are certain the healers will not wear their veils during the gathering?" "It is tradition," Colin confirmed. "Public injuries during a public gathering are treated openly. Only your private wounds are tended in secrecy as the old laws dictate." Kane said nothing for a long moment, his mind turning over the possibility that had just been placed before him. Weeks of searching, weeks of restless nights and unanswered questions, and now fate seemed prepared to offer him exactly what he had been seeking, whether or not he was fully prepared for whatever discovery awaited him in that crowded hall. "Then I will be watching closely," Kane said quietly, more to himself than to Colin, "when the gathering begins." Colin studied his king for a long moment, concern flickering behind his steady gaze. "And if you find her, my king, what then? You know as well as I do that recognizing a mate is only the beginning. If her circumstances are as complicated as the whispers suggest, finding her will not be the end of your difficulties. It may only be where they truly begin." Kane did not have an answer for that, not one he was ready to voice aloud, but something settled within him nonetheless, a quiet certainty that had been building steadily since that first night in the healer's den. Whatever difficulties awaited him once he finally found her, whatever shadow from her past made her fear discovery so deeply, he intended to face it directly rather than allow uncertainty to keep them separated any longer. The gathering was still a week away, but for the first time since his wolf had first stirred with recognition in the darkness of that healer's den, Kane felt something close to hope settling alongside the restlessness that had consumed him for weeks. Soon, he told himself, soon he would finally see her face. The day of the gathering arrived beneath a clear sky, the mountain air crisp enough to carry the scent of pine and wood smoke through the open courtyard, where banners from allied packs snapped gently in the wind. By mid-morning, wolves from across the territory had begun arriving in steady streams. Their delegations announced formally at the gates before being welcomed into the great hall, where long tables had been arranged beneath high stone arches. Ren arrived with the other healers assigned to attend, her stomach twisted into knots that refused to loosen no matter how many steadying breaths she took. She wore her hair loose for the first time in years, no veil to hide behind, her face fully visible to anyone who happened to glance in her direction. She felt exposed in a way that made her skin prickle uncomfortably, as though every eye in the hall might somehow recognize the shame she carried simply by looking at her features. She positioned herself near the healing station set up along the eastern wall, close enough to the sparring grounds outside to respond quickly should injuries occur during the exhibitions planned for the afternoon, but far enough from the main gathering that she hoped to remain relatively unnoticed among the crowd. The morning passed without incident, formal greetings exchanged between delegation leaders, gifts presented according to tradition, careful diplomatic conversations conducted over food and drink. Ren watched from her position near the wall, grateful for the relative anonymity the crowd provided despite her uncovered face, and allowed herself to hope, cautiously, that perhaps this gathering would pass without the confrontation she had spent the past week dreading. That hope shattered the moment the sparring exhibitions began. The exhibitions were held in the open courtyard just beyond the Great Hall, where warriors from each delegation demonstrated their skill against one another in controlled matches meant to display strength without provoking genuine conflict between allied packs. Kane, as host and Alpha King, stood near the front of the gathered crowd, watching the matches with the composed attention expected of his position, though his mind remained only partially focused on the display before him. His wolf had been restless since the moment he entered the hall that morning, some instinct pulling at his attention with an intensity he had not felt since that first night in the healer's den. He scanned the crowd repeatedly throughout the morning, searching faces he did not recognize, waiting for some sign, some scent, some flicker of certainty that would tell him he had finally found what he had been searching for. The sign came sooner than he expected, and far more dramatically than he could have anticipated. Midway through the exhibitions, a young warrior from Garrick's delegation misjudged a strike during a sparring match, his blade catching his opponent across the forearm with more force than the exhibition rules permitted. The injured warrior stumbled backward with a sharp cry of pain, blood welling quickly from the gash, and the crowd surged forward with concerned murmurs as officials rushed to separate the combatants. "Healer!" someone called urgently, and Ren moved without hesitation, years of training overriding the anxiety that had consumed her all morning. She pushed through the gathering crowd with quick, practiced steps, reaching the injured warrior within moments, her hands already reaching for the supplies she carried at her belt. "Let me see it," she said firmly, kneeling beside the fallen warrior, her voice carrying the same calm authority it always did when a wound needed tending. She pressed a clean cloth firmly against the gash, assessing its depth with quick, careful movements, her focus narrowing entirely onto the task before her. Across the courtyard, Kane's entire body went rigid. The scent reached him before his mind fully registered what was happening, carried faintly on the breeze despite the crowd and the commotion surrounding the injured warrior. Crushed herbs and rain, unmistakable and achingly familiar, the exact scent that had haunted his memory for weeks since that first night in the healer's den. His wolf surged forward beneath his skin, with a force that nearly stole his breath, every instinct screaming a single certainty into his mind. Her. It was her. He moved through the crowd before he had fully decided to, his usual composed authority forgotten entirely as something far more primal took hold, guiding his steps directly toward the healer kneeling over the injured warrior. Colin noticed the shift immediately, moving quickly to intercept him. "My king," Colin said quietly, falling into step beside him, his voice low enough that only Kane could hear. "Steady yourself. The entire gathering is watching." Kane barely heard him, his attention fixed entirely on the woman kneeling in the courtyard, her hair falling loose around her face as she worked with quick, efficient hands to stem the bleeding from the warrior's arm. He could not yet see her clearly through the crowd still gathered around the injured man, but the scent grew stronger with every step he took, confirming what his wolf had already known with absolute certainty. Ren felt it before she saw him, a prickling awareness crawling across her skin that had nothing to do with the wound she tended, or the crowd pressing close around her. She looked up instinctively, her eyes scanning the gathered onlookers, and found Kane's gaze already fixed directly on her from across the courtyard, his expression carrying an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. The crowd continued its concerned murmuring around the injured warrior, officials calling for space, other healers arriving to assist. But between Kane and Ren, the entire world seemed to narrow down to that single locked gaze, recognition passing between them with a force neither could deny any longer. Then the moment shattered as the injured warrior groaned sharply, drawing Ren's attention back to her immediate task, and Kane found himself forcibly reminded of his duties as host, the crowd around him still watching, still waiting for his response to the incident that had briefly disrupted the exhibitions. "See that the warrior is properly tended," Kane said, his voice carrying an authority that did not fully match the turmoil churning beneath his composed exterior. "The exhibitions will resume once he has been treated." The crowd dispersed slowly back toward the exhibition grounds, murmuring amongst themselves about the incident, but Kane remained rooted in place for a moment longer, watching as Ren finished securing a bandage around the warrior's arm with quick, competent movements. She did not look up at him again, though he could see the slight tremor in her hands as she worked, the careful way she avoided meeting his gaze even as she surely felt the weight of his attention still fixed upon her. Colin appeared at his side once more, his expression carrying quiet understanding. "That is her, you are certain?" "I am certain," Kane said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I would know that scent anywhere." "Then you finally have your answer," Colin said carefully, watching as Ren helped the injured warrior to his feet and guided him toward the healing station along the eastern wall, her posture rigid with an anxiety that had nothing to do with the wound she had just treated. "The question now is what you intend to do with it." Kane did not answer immediately, his eyes still following Ren's retreating figure as she disappeared into the crowd near the healing station. Weeks of searching, weeks of restless nights and unanswered questions, and finally, in the span of a single suspended moment across a crowded courtyard, his wolf had found exactly what it had been seeking all along. But recognition, he understood now, was only the beginning. Whatever fear had kept her hidden for weeks, whatever shadow from her past made her flinch even now at the weight of his gaze, remained unresolved between them, a distance that recognition alone could not close. He intended to close it regardless. "I will speak with her," Kane said finally, his voice carrying quiet determination despite the crowd still gathered around them. "Before this gathering ends, I will speak with her directly." Colin studied his king for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then choose your moment carefully, my king. She has spent weeks avoiding exactly this outcome. Whatever fear drives that avoidance will not simply disappear because recognition has finally been confirmed. If anything, cornering her too suddenly may only deepen it. Cain absorbed the warning silently, his gaze drifting once more toward the healing station, where Ren now stood among the other healers, her shoulders still tense, her hands still trembling faintly as she organized her supplies. Whatever conversation awaited them, he understood it would require patience he had not yet fully mastered, restraint that his wolf, now fully awakened to her presence, would find increasingly difficult to maintain. But he had waited weeks already. He could wait a little longer, if patience meant finally understanding the truth behind the fear that had kept her hidden from him for so long. The exhibitions resumed shortly after, the gathering continuing as though nothing significant had occurred. But for both Cain and Ren, standing on opposite sides of a courtyard filled with hundreds of watching eyes, everything had changed in that single locked gaze. The distance between them, carefully maintained for weeks through veils and silence and careful avoidance, had finally, undeniably, begun to close. Evening settled over the fortress as the gathering shifted from formal exhibitions into the feasting that traditionally closed the first day of celebrations. Long tables filled the great hall, laden with food and drink, laughter and conversation rising steadily as delegations from across the territory mingled beneath the flickering light of countless candles. Ren remained near the healing station longer than necessary, using the excuse of organizing supplies to avoid joining the crowd gathering for the feast. Her hands moved through familiar tasks, folding linens, sorting herbs into their proper containers, but her mind remained fixed entirely on the moment their eyes had met across the courtyard, on the certainty she had seen reflected in his gaze, a certainty that matched exactly what her own wolf had recognized weeks ago and had been fighting to deny ever since. She told herself she would slip away quietly once the feast reached its height, retreating to her small quarters before anyone noticed her absence. But fate, it seemed, had grown tired of allowing her that particular comfort. "You handled that injury well today." The voice came from directly behind her, low and unmistakably familiar, and Ren froze completely, her hands stilling over the linens she had been folding. She did not need to turn around to know who stood there. Every instinct in her body had already recognized his presence the moment he spoke, her pulse quickening in a way that had nothing to do with fear alone. "Thank you, my king," she said carefully, keeping her back to him, her voice steadier than she felt. "It was a simple wound, nothing beyond ordinary training. You moved quickly," Cain continued, stepping closer, though he kept enough distance that she did not feel cornered, a restraint she noticed, despite her racing thoughts. "With confidence. The kind that comes from experience treating far more serious injuries than a shallow cut during sparring." Ren's fingers tightened around the linen in her hands. "Healers train for many years, my king. Confidence comes with practice, nothing more." "Perhaps," Cain said quietly. "Or perhaps I recognize that confidence from another night, weeks ago, in a healer's den, where a wound far more serious than today's required exactly that same steady certainty." Ren's breath caught sharply in her chest. She finally turned to face him, her expression carefully composed despite the panic clawing beneath her ribs, and found his eyes already fixed on hers with an intensity that made denial feel impossible, even as the words rose automatically to her lips. "I do not know what you mean," she said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the lie even as she spoke it. "Do you not?" Cain said softly, taking one careful step closer, close enough now that she could smell the faint scent of wood smoke clinging to his clothing from the evening's festivities, close enough that she felt the full weight of his attention settling over her like something physical. "My wolf recognized your scent the moment you knelt beside that injured warrior today, crushed herbs and rain, exactly as it was that first night, when your hands stitched the wound at my side and your voice was the only thing keeping the pain from overwhelming me entirely." Ren's hands trembled visibly now, the linen slipping slightly from her grip before she caught it again. "My king, I am simply a healer among many. Whatever your wolf believes it recognized, I cannot." Ren. Her name, spoken quietly but with absolute certainty, stole whatever protest she had been preparing to voice. She had never told him her name. No one had. And yet he spoke it as though he had known it all along, as though some deeper recognition had supplied the answer his conscious mind had been searching for through weeks of restless questioning. "How?" she whispered, her composed facade finally cracking beneath the weight of his certainty. "Do you know my name?" "Illyra," Cain admitted quietly. "I spoke with her earlier this evening, after the exhibitions ended. I did not force the confession from her, if that is your concern. I simply asked her directly whether my wolf's instincts had led me correctly, and she, seeing perhaps that continued silence would only prolong an inevitable truth, confirmed what I already knew beyond any doubt. Ren felt something crumble inside her chest. The careful walls she had spent years constructing finally beginning to give way beneath a truth she could no longer outrun. She set the linens down on the nearby table, her hands still trembling, and forced herself to meet his gaze directly for the first time since that night weeks ago, when her hands had tended his wounds in darkness. "Then you know everything," she said quietly, bitterness creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to remain composed. "You know why I hid, why I have spent years hiding, long before that night ever brought us into the same room." "I know only that Alira mentioned something about your family's history," Kane said carefully. "She did not elaborate beyond confirming your name and your identity as the healer who tended me. Whatever burden you carry regarding your family, I have not yet heard it directly from you." Ren's jaw tightened, old shame rising alongside newer fears, tangled together into something she had spent years trying to suppress entirely. "My grandfather was accused of betraying pack secrets to a rival territory, 2 generations before I was born. Whether the accusation was true or false no longer matters. The shame attached itself to my family permanently, and every descendant since has been forbidden from rising beyond the lowest ranks of service. I am only permitted to work as a healer because my skill is needed and my silence guaranteed." She paused, forcing herself to continue despite the tremor creeping into her voice. "If it becomes known that the healer who tended the Alpha King through his most vulnerable night carries that same disgraced bloodline, it will not matter how many lives I have saved since. The scandal alone will be enough to end everything, not just for me, but for anyone connected to my family, who still hopes for something better than the shadow we have lived beneath for generations." Kane listened in silence, his expression shifting through something complicated, anger flickering briefly behind his eyes though it was not directed at her, something closer to protective fury settling over features that had gone rigid with restrained emotion. 2 generations, he said finally, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Ren's breath catch. "An accusation against your grandfather, never proven, has shaped your entire life, kept you hidden and afraid, all this time." "It is not so simple as unproven or proven," Ren said, though her voice carried less certainty now than it had moments before. "The council decided long ago that the shame was sufficient regardless of proof. That decision has stood for generations. It is not something that changes simply because—" "Because what?" Kane interrupted gently, stepping close enough now that she could see the full intensity in his gaze, no longer distant or composed, but raw with something she had never expected to see directed toward her. "Because my wolf recognized yours the moment you touched my wounds in the darkness? Because whatever connects us now exists regardless of what council decisions were made before either of us were born." Ren had no answer for that, her carefully maintained composure finally breaking apart entirely beneath the weight of weeks of fear and exhaustion, and the impossible reality standing directly before her. She felt tears threatening at the edges of her eyes, tears she refused to let fall, and pressed her lips together tightly rather than allow herself the vulnerability of speaking further. "I am not asking you to explain generations of council decisions tonight," Kane said, his voice softening further, the intensity in his gaze tempered now with something gentler, something that made Ren's chest ache with feelings she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. "I am only asking you to understand that whatever shame you believe you carry, my wolf did not recognize a bloodline or a family's history. It recognized you, only you. That recognition changes nothing about the danger it creates," Ren said quietly, though her voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. "For me, for my family, for you as well, my king. Should the council decide your judgment has been compromised by association with a disgraced bloodline, let me worry about the council," Kane said firmly. "You have carried this fear alone for far too long already." Ren studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any hint of the political calculation she had expected to find, should this moment ever arrive. Any sign that his interest was born from curiosity or obligation rather than something deeper. She found none, only steady, unwavering certainty, and something beneath it that looked remarkably like the same fear she carried herself. Fear of losing something neither of them had expected to find. "I do not know how to trust that this will not end badly," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then allow me the chance to prove it," Kane said quietly, extending nothing more than his open hand between them. A simple gesture that carried far more weight than either of them fully acknowledged in that moment. "Not tonight, if you are not ready, but soon. Allow me the chance to show you that whatever shadow follows your family's name does not have to define whatever this becomes between us." Ren looked down at his open hand, hesitation warring visibly with something deeper stirring beneath years of carefully constructed walls. She did not take his hand that night, not yet, the fear still too deeply rooted to release so quickly. But she did not step away either, and for the first time since that night weeks ago in the healer's den, she allowed herself to consider, however cautiously, that perhaps fate had not chosen her for destruction after all. Perhaps, despite everything, it had chosen her for something else entirely. News of what had happened between Cain and Ren did not remain contained for long, despite both their efforts at discretion. A servant who had passed near the healing station that evening had overheard fragments of their conversation, enough to piece together a story that spread through the gathering with the particular speed reserved for scandal involving a king. By the second day of the gathering, whispers had reached every corner of the fortress, distorted and exaggerated with each retelling, but carrying enough truth at their core to draw the attention of exactly the people Ren had feared most. Edmund summoned Cain to a private meeting before the morning's formal proceedings began, his expression grave in a way that told Cain immediately the elder had already heard more than he wished to know. "You spoke with her," Edmund said without preamble, closing the door behind him firmly. "Publicly enough that half the gathering now knows her name, and enough of her circumstances to draw their own conclusions." "I spoke with her privately," Cain corrected, though he did not bother denying the substance of Edmund's concern. "Whatever spread beyond that conversation was not my doing." "Privacy means little when servants have ears, and gossip travels faster than any of us can control," Edmund said sharply. "Do you understand what you have done? The healer's identity, protected for generations specifically to prevent this exact situation, has now been exposed. And not simply exposed, but exposed as belonging to a bloodline the council formally disgraced generations ago. Her grandfather's accusation was never proven," Cain said, his voice hardening. "I have looked into the old records myself since our conversation last night. The evidence against him was circumstantial at best, and the council's decision to punish generations of his descendants for an unproven accusation was, in my judgment, unjust from the beginning." Edmund's expression tightened at that, clearly unprepared for the depth of Cain's conviction on the matter. Whether the original judgment was just or unjust is not the question currently facing us. The question is how the allied packs currently gathered within these walls will react to learning that their Alpha King's wolf has recognized a mate from a bloodline officially marked as dishonorable. "I do not require the allied pack's approval to acknowledge what my wolf has recognized," Cain said firmly. "You may not require it," Edmund said, "but you will certainly feel its absence should it be withheld. Garrick, in particular, has already begun making inquiries this morning. He is not a wolf who allows opportunities for weakening your position to pass unused." Cain's jaw tightened at the mention of Garrick's name, understanding immediately the danger Edmund was describing. Garrick had spent years searching for any advantage that might elevate his own standing at Cain's expense, and a scandal involving disgraced bloodlines and questionable judgment would provide exactly the kind of ammunition he had long been seeking. The confirmation of Edmund's warning arrived sooner than expected, during the formal proceedings held later that morning in the Great Hall. Delegation leaders from across the territory gathered to discuss matters of trade and mutual defense, the usual business of such gatherings, until Garrick, seated prominently among the Eastern delegation, raised his hand to request the floor with a deliberate calm that immediately put Cain on guard. "I have heard troubling rumors since arriving at this gathering," Garrick said, his voice carrying easily through the hall, pitched precisely to draw maximum attention without appearing overtly confrontational. "Rumors suggesting our host's judgment has been compromised by personal entanglement with a healer whose family carries a formal mark of disgrace within this very territory." Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegations, exactly the reaction Garrick had clearly intended. Cain felt his wolf bristle immediately beneath his composed exterior, though he forced his expression to remain steady, refusing to give Garrick the satisfaction of an emotional reaction in front of the gathered leaders. "I am uncertain what rumors you refer to," Cain said evenly, "but I would remind you that my personal matters are not typically subject to discussion during formal proceedings concerning trade and defense. Personal matters become relevant," Garrick countered smoothly, "when they touch upon the judgment of the leader responsible for maintaining agreements between our territories. If the Alpha King's wolf has indeed recognized a mate from a bloodline formally disgraced for betraying pack secrets, one might reasonably question whether that same vulnerability could be exploited by anyone seeking to undermine agreements currently in place." The implication hung heavy in the hall, deliberately provocative, suggesting that Ren herself might pose a security risk simply by association with her family's history. Cain felt fury rising sharply beneath his controlled exterior, but he recognized, even through the anger, that responding too forcefully would only confirm Garrick's implication that his judgment had indeed been compromised. The healer in question saved my life through her skill alone, Kane said, his voice carrying quiet authority despite the tension coiling through his body. Whatever history her family carries, generations removed from any accusation that was never conclusively proven, has no bearing on her character or her loyalty, both of which I have witnessed directly. Witnessed directly, Garrick repeated, a faint smile touching his lips that made Kane's fury sharpen further. Through a single night of treatment, and apparently one private conversation since. Forgive me, but that seems a rather thin foundation upon which to dismiss generations of council judgment regarding her family's trustworthiness. Edmund, seated among the Northern Territory's own representatives, finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience navigating exactly this kind of political maneuvering. The council's original judgment regarding the healer's grandfather was based on circumstantial evidence. As I understand the historical records, it would perhaps serve this gathering better to focus on matters of trade and defense currently before us, rather than relitigating decisions made generations before any of us held our current positions. Garrick's gaze flickered toward Edmund, recognizing the elder's intervention for exactly what it was, an attempt to close a line of attack before it could gain further momentum. But he was not so easily deterred, his ambition too deeply invested in the opportunity currently presenting itself. Perhaps, Garrick said smoothly, but surely the gathered leaders here today deserve reassurance that our host's judgment remains sound, particularly given how recently this apparent entanglement has developed. A king, distracted by personal matters, however sincere his feelings may be, is not always a king capable of maintaining the vigilance his position requires. The hall fell into tense silence, delegation leaders exchanging uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the proceedings had taken but equally uncertain how to redirect it without appearing to take sides in what had quickly become a delicate political matter. Kane rose slowly from his seat, drawing every eye in the hall toward him, his presence commanding attention even without raising his voice. My judgment, Kane said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, has never wavered regarding the agreements currently in place between our territories, nor will it waver now. Whatever personal matters exist in my life remain separate from my responsibilities as host and alpha of this territory. I would remind everyone gathered here that questioning a king's judgment based on rumor and unproven historical accusation is a dangerous precedent, one that could easily be turned against any leader present in this hall, should someone choose to search hard enough for grievances buried generations in the past. The pointed warning was not lost on the assembled leaders, several of whom shifted uncomfortably, aware that their own family histories likely contained similar complications that could be weaponized under the same logic Garrick had just employed. Garrick's expression tightened slightly, recognizing that Kane had successfully turned the implicit threat back toward the broader gathering rather than allowing it to remain focused solely on his own circumstances. I intend no disrespect toward your authority, Garrick said, his tone shifting slightly toward something more conciliatory, though the underlying challenge remained clearly present beneath his words. I simply raised the matter out of concern for the stability of agreements we all depend upon. Your concern has been noted, Kane said evenly. Now, if there are no further matters requiring discussion beyond rumor and speculation, I believe we have trade agreements to finalize. The proceedings continued after that, though the tension Garrick had introduced lingered heavily beneath the surface of subsequent discussions. Kane maintained his composed authority throughout, but beneath that careful control, his wolf paced restlessly, fury and protectiveness intertwining into something sharp and unyielding. He understood now, more clearly than before, that acknowledging Ren publicly would not simply be a matter of personal choice. It would require confronting political consequences far more significant than he had initially anticipated, consequences that threatened not only his own standing among allied packs but potentially Ren's safety as well, should Garrick or others like him decide that undermining her position served their broader ambitions. But understanding the difficulty ahead did not diminish his resolve. If anything, watching Garrick attempt to weaponize her family's history against her only strengthened Kane's determination to ensure that whatever shadow had followed Ren for generations would not be permitted to define her future any longer. The gathering would continue for 2 more days, and Kane understood, walking out of the great hall with Edmund's cautious gaze following him closely, that whatever peace had settled over the Northern Territory in recent years was about to be tested in ways none of them had anticipated when the gathering first began. Word of what had happened during the formal proceedings reached Ren by midday, delivered by an anxious young apprentice who had heard the exchange secondhand from a serving girl present in the hall. Ren listened to the account with a growing sense of dread settling heavily in her chest, each detail confirming exactly the fear that had kept her hidden for years. The fear that her family's shame would eventually surface to cause harm not just to herself, but to anyone who dared associate with her. She retreated to the small storage room where dried herbs still hung from the ceiling, the same room where Alira had once tried to counsel her through her earlier uncertainty, and sat heavily on an overturned crate, her hands pressed against her face as she tried to steady her racing thoughts. This was precisely what she had feared, not simply personal exposure, but political consequence, the kind of scandal that could unravel alliances and weaken the very territory Cain was sworn to protect. She had told him as much the previous night, had warned him clearly that acknowledging her carried risks beyond simple personal discomfort, and now, within the space of a single morning, those risks had already begun manifesting exactly as she had predicted. Alira found her there an hour later, drawn by concern when Ren failed to appear for her scheduled duties at the healing station. She studied Ren's tense posture for a long moment before speaking, her voice gentle despite the weight of what she clearly already understood. "You have heard then," Alira said quietly, settling onto a nearby crate across from her. "The Eastern Alpha used my family's history to question the king's judgment in front of every delegation gathered here," Ren said, her voice tight with a mixture of shame and helpless anger. "This is exactly what I feared would happen, not simply exposure, but consequences reaching far beyond myself. Cain defended you," Alira said carefully. "From what I have heard, he defended you quite firmly, and turned the Alpha's implication back upon the broader gathering, rather than allowing it to stand unchallenged." "That does not undo the damage already caused," Ren said, rising abruptly from the crate to pace the small space, her earlier composure fully abandoned now beneath the weight of guilt and fear tangled together. "Whatever authority he maintains, whatever careful balance he has kept with allied territories over the years, I have now become a liability to all of it, simply by existing, simply by being who I am." "You did not choose your grandfather's accusation," Alira said firmly. "Nor did you choose the council's decision to punish generations for it. You are not responsible for consequences born from choices made long before you existed. Responsibility does not always follow choice," Ren said quietly, stopping her pacing to face Alira directly. "Sometimes it simply follows circumstance, regardless of fault. I think perhaps the wisest course now is to remove myself from this situation entirely. If I am no longer present, no longer visible as a source of complication, perhaps the political difficulty this has created will resolve itself far more easily than if I remain." Alira's expression sharpened with immediate concern. "You are speaking of leaving the territory entirely." "I am speaking of considering it," Ren admitted, though even as she spoke the words, something in her chest tightened painfully at the thought. "Better that than watching everything unravel because I was too afraid to remove myself from danger I created, simply by being recognized." "You created nothing," Alira said sharply, rising to her feet as well, her usual gentle patience giving way to something firmer. "Fate created this, if you believe in such things, or simple chance if you do not. Either way, running from it now will not undo what has already occurred, and it may cost you something far more valuable than the safety you believe you would be securing." Before Ren could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door, and before either woman could answer, the door opened to reveal Cain standing in the threshold, his expression tight with barely restrained urgency. "I was told you might be here," he said, his eyes finding Ren immediately, relief flickering briefly across his features, before settling into something more serious. "I need to speak with you." Alira glanced between them for a moment before offering a small, knowing nod and slipping quietly from the room, leaving the door open behind her as she departed, granting them privacy while maintaining the appearance of propriety. "I heard what happened during the proceedings," Ren said, before Cain could speak further, her voice carrying the same tight anxiety that had consumed her since the apprentice first delivered the news. "I heard how the Eastern Alpha used my family's history against you, in front of every delegation gathered here. This is exactly what I feared, my king. This is exactly why I tried to remain hidden." "Garrick's attempt to weaponize your family's history failed," Cain said firmly, stepping further into the room, closing the distance between them with careful, deliberate steps. "I made certain of that during the proceedings themselves. He gained nothing from the attempt beyond exposing his own willingness to search generations into the past for grievances he might exploit. He gained enough to plant doubt," Ren said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "Enough to make other delegation leaders question your judgment, however briefly. That doubt does not simply disappear because you defended yourself well in the moment." "Perhaps not entirely," Cain admitted, "but doubt planted through rumor and unproven accusation rarely survives sustained scrutiny, especially when the truth behind it is far less scandalous than Garrick attempted to suggest." I have already begun looking into the original records concerning your grandfather's accusation. The evidence was circumstantial from the beginning, insufficient by any reasonable standard to justify the punishment inflicted upon your family for generations since. Ren's breath caught at that admission, uncertainty flickering across her expression. You have been looking into old records. Since when? Since our conversation last night, Kane said quietly. I could not simply accept your family's shame as settled fact once I understood how deeply it had shaped your life. I intend to bring the matter before the council formally, to argue for a review of the original judgment based on the insufficient evidence that supported it. That could take months, Ren said, though something in her chest had begun to loosen slightly at the depth of effort he was describing. Years, perhaps, given how deeply entrenched such council decisions typically become once established. Then it will take months, or years, if that is what is required, Kane said firmly, closing the remaining distance between them, until he stood only a step away, close enough that she could see the unwavering certainty in his gaze. I am not interested in quick solutions that leave the underlying injustice unresolved. I want your family's name restored properly, not simply overlooked or quietly excused. Ren studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of political calculation, any sign that his commitment was born from something less than genuine conviction. She found none, only the same steady determination she had glimpsed the previous night, tempered now with a fierceness that told her he had spent considerable thought on the matter since their conversation had ended. Elira suggested I might consider leaving the territory entirely, Ren admitted quietly, watching his reaction carefully as she spoke. To remove myself as a source of political complication before the difficulty grows any worse. Something sharp flickered across Kane's expression at that, his jaw tightening visibly. Leaving would not resolve the difficulty. It would only ensure that Garrick and anyone like him succeed in driving away someone my wolf has recognized as mine, based entirely on rumor and unproven accusation from generations past. I will not allow that outcome, Ren, not while I have breath left to fight against it. And if fighting against it costs you your standing among allied territories, Ren asked, her voice carrying genuine concern despite the warmth spreading through her chest at his fierce declaration. If Garrick and others like him use this to weaken agreements you have spent years maintaining, then I will rebuild whatever standing is lost, Kane said simply, because the alternative, allowing fear and old prejudice to dictate who I am permitted to care for, is not an alternative I am willing to accept. My wolf chose you, Ren, not your family's history, not generations of council judgment. You. And I do not intend to let anyone, Garrick included, convince me otherwise. Ren felt tears threatening at the edges of her eyes once more, though this time they carried something far different from the fear and shame that had driven her earlier retreat into the storage room. She reached out slowly, finally closing the distance he had left open the previous night, her hand finding his where it rested at his side. I am still frightened, she admitted quietly, her fingers curling gently around his, of what this could cost you, of what it could still cost my family, should the council's review not proceed as you hope. I am frightened as well, Kane admitted, surprising her with the honesty in his voice, of losing something I only recently understood I had found. But I would rather face that fear directly, alongside you, than allow it to convince either of us that hiding remains the safer path. We have already spent enough time hidden from each other. I do not intend to spend any more. Ren said nothing further, but she did not release his hand either, and for the first time since the gathering had begun, since fate had forced their recognition into the open beneath a crowded courtyard sky, she allowed herself to believe, cautiously, that perhaps the path ahead, however difficult, might lead somewhere worth the fear required to walk it. The final day of the gathering arrived with an unusual tension threaded through the fortress, servants and delegates alike moving with the particular caution of people who sense something significant approaching, without yet knowing its shape. Word had spread overnight that Kane intended to formally acknowledge Ren before the assembled delegations, a declaration that would settle, once and for all, the question Garrick had attempted to weaponize during the previous day's proceedings. Garrick, unwilling to allow his earlier attempt to fade quietly into irrelevance, requested a private audience with Kane before the closing ceremonies began. Colin accompanied Kane to the meeting, standing watchful near the door as the two alphas faced each other across a narrow chamber, lit only by pale morning light filtering through a high window. You intend to acknowledge her publicly, Garrick said without preamble, his earlier smooth diplomacy replaced now with something harder, more direct. Despite everything I raised yesterday, I intend to acknowledge what my wolf has already recognized, Kane replied evenly, regardless of objections raised from ambition rather than genuine concern. Garrick's expression tightened at that, the accusation landing precisely where Kane had intended it. You believe my concerns yesterday were born from ambition alone. I believe, Kane said, that you have spent years searching for any opportunity to weaken my standing among allied territories, and yesterday you found one you believed sufficient to serve that purpose. I do not believe your concern for the stability of our agreements runs any deeper than that. Perhaps, Garrick said, his voice dropping into something colder, more deliberate. Or perhaps I simply believe a king who allows sentiment to override generations of council judgment demonstrates exactly the kind of weakness that invites challenge. The word hung heavy in the small chamber, its meaning unmistakable to everyone present. Colin straightened near the door, tension visibly gathering through his shoulders, while Kane's expression settled into something calm and immovable despite the weight of what Garrick had just implied. You are invoking the old right, Kane said quietly. It was not a question. I am considering it, Garrick said. The ancient law permits any alpha to challenge another's fitness to lead, should sufficient cause exist. Marrying into a formally disgraced bloodline, against the council's established judgment, might reasonably constitute such cause in the eyes of many gathered here. The old right has not been invoked in generations, Kane said, his voice carrying a warning edge beneath its calm surface. Precisely because it exists as a measure of absolute last resort, not a tool for political maneuvering when other avenues have failed to achieve one's ambitions. Then perhaps it is time it was invoked again, Garrick said, to remind this gathering that leadership carries responsibility beyond personal desire, however sincere that desire might be. Kane studied his rival for a long moment, understanding settling over him with quiet, unshakable certainty. Garrick had come prepared for exactly this outcome, had likely planned this confrontation from the moment rumors of Kane's connection to Wren first reached him. There would be no reasoning him away from this path now, no diplomatic solution that would satisfy ambition this deeply entrenched. If you intend to invoke the old right, Kane said finally, his voice carrying absolute steadiness despite the gravity of what was being decided, then I will meet that challenge directly, here, before this gathering ends, and we will settle this matter according to the very tradition you claim to be honoring. Garrick's eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps surprised by the immediacy of Kane's acceptance, though he recovered quickly, inclining his head in formal acknowledgement. Then it is settled. The challenge will be honored according to ancient tradition, witnessed by all delegations currently gathered within these walls. Word of the challenge spread through the fortress within the hour, and by midday, the entire courtyard had been cleared and prepared, delegation leaders and their warriors gathering along the perimeter, to witness what few among them had ever seen conducted in earnest rather than read about in old records. Wren learned of the challenge from Alira, who found her at the healing station, and delivered the news with visible alarm evident beneath her usual composed demeanor. He is challenging Kane's fitness to lead, Alira said quietly, watching Wren's face drain of color as the words registered fully. Over the matter of acknowledging you, the ancient right permits such challenges, though it has not been invoked in generations. This is exactly what I feared, Wren said, her voice tight with rising panic. I told him this would happen. I told him the cost would be more than simple political friction. There is no time now to relitigate what should or should not have happened, Alira said firmly, though her expression carried genuine concern of her own. The challenge has already been accepted. It will be settled this afternoon, before the gathering formally ends. Wren felt her stomach twist painfully at the thought of Kane facing physical challenge on her account, memories of his wounds from the battle weeks earlier still fresh enough in her mind to make the danger feel immediate and real, despite how fully he had since healed. She made her way to the courtyard alongside the other gathered onlookers, her heart pounding with a dread unlike anything she had experienced even during the tense confrontation in the healer's storage room. The crowd had assembled in a wide circle, delegation leaders positioned prominently near the front, warriors and servants filling the remaining space, all eyes fixed on the open ground at the center where the challenge would be settled. Kane and Garrick stood at opposite ends of the cleared circle, both having shed their formal attire for simple training clothes suited to the physical demands ahead. Edmund stood near the circle's edge, serving as the formal witness required by ancient tradition, his expression grave as he called the assembly to order. This challenge is invoked under the old right, Edmund announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. Garrick Voss, Alpha of the Eastern Border Pack, challenges Kane Ashgrove's fitness to lead the Northern Territory, on grounds relating to judgment demonstrated in matters of personal conduct. The challenge will be settled through controlled combat, honor-bound by ancient tradition, ending upon clear submission or incapacity, not upon lasting harm. Do both parties understand and accept these terms? I accept, Kane said firmly, his gaze fixed steadily on Garrick across the circle. "I accept," Garrick echoed, his own expression carrying grim determination beneath its practiced calm. Ren watched from near the healing station positioned at the circle's edge, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, every instinct screaming at her to intervene despite knowing such interference would violate tradition far too deeply rooted to overturn in a single moment of fear. The combat began at Edmund's signal, both alphas circling each other carefully at first, testing footing and distance with the wary respect of two experienced fighters who understood exactly how dangerous their opponent could prove. Garrick struck first, a swift feint followed by a genuine attempt to close the distance, but Kane sidestepped smoothly, redirecting the momentum with practiced ease honed through years of leading his territory's warriors in training. The exchange that followed was fierce but controlled, both wolves drawing on strength and skill built over years of discipline rather than uncontrolled aggression. Kane's wounds from weeks earlier had fully healed, his strength restored completely, and whatever restlessness his wolf had carried since recognizing Ren now channeled itself into focused, deliberate purpose, as he met each of Garrick's attempts with calculated precision. Garrick fought with the desperation of ambition finally given physical outlet, pressing forward with increasing intensity as the match progressed. But Kane's steadier discipline began to show as the minutes stretched onward, his movements economical where Garrick's grew increasingly forceful, his defense solid where Garrick's ambition occasionally outpaced his control. The turning point came when Garrick, frustrated by his inability to gain lasting advantage, overextended during a forward strike, and Kane seized the opening decisively, redirecting Garrick's own momentum against him, and bringing the challenge to its conclusion, with a controlled maneuver that left his rival pinned firmly against the ground, unable to continue without formally yielding. The courtyard fell utterly silent, every eye fixed on the two alphas as Garrick, breathing heavily beneath Kane's controlled hold, finally spoke the words tradition required. "I yield," Garrick said, the admission clearly costing him considerable pride, though he had no alternative remaining available to him. Kane released him immediately, stepping back to allow his rival to rise, extending no further aggression now that the challenge had reached its formal conclusion. Edmund moved forward quickly to confirm the outcome before the assembled witnesses. "The challenge is settled," Edmund announced, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Kane Ashgrove's fitness to lead the Northern Territory stands confirmed, according to the ancient rite invoked this day. Let no further challenge be raised on these same grounds." The crowd erupted into a mixture of murmured reactions, some relieved, some clearly disappointed by the outcome, depending on where their loyalties had rested throughout the tense confrontation. Ren felt her legs nearly give way beneath the sudden release of tension that had gripped her throughout the entire exchange, relief flooding through her so completely that tears finally spilled freely down her cheeks, despite her efforts to maintain composure before the watching crowd. Kane's gaze found hers immediately across the courtyard, his chest still rising and falling from the exertion of the challenge, but his expression carrying something steady and triumphant beneath the physical exhaustion. He crossed the distance between them without hesitation, ignoring the watching crowd entirely, until he stood directly before her, close enough that she could see the faint bruising already forming along his jaw from the exchange. "It is done," he said quietly, his voice carrying quiet relief despite its low volume. "No one can question my judgment regarding you any longer, not after this. The ancient rite has spoken, and its verdict stands beyond further challenge." Ren reached up instinctively, her fingers brushing gently against the bruise forming along his jaw, her touch far gentler than the fierce combat that had produced it. "You should not have had to fight for something that should never have required fighting at all." "Perhaps not," Kane agreed quietly, "but I would fight it again, without hesitation, if it meant securing the certainty we now have. No one gathered here today can claim my judgment has been compromised, Ren. Not after what they have just witnessed." Behind them, Garrick was being helped from the ground by members of his own delegation, his expression carrying the particular bitterness of ambition thoroughly defeated, though he said nothing further, understanding clearly that the ancient rite's verdict left no room for further contest. Edmund approached them both a moment later, his expression carrying something Ren had not expected to see directed toward her, quiet respect rather than the guarded caution she had grown accustomed to from pack elders throughout her life. "The council will need to formally address the matter of your family's history now," Edmund said, addressing Ren directly for the first time since the gathering began. "Given today's outcome, I believe there may finally be sufficient will among the elders to review the original judgment against your grandfather properly, rather than allowing it to stand simply through generations of unquestioned tradition." Ren felt something loosen in her chest at those words, a weight she had carried for years beginning, finally, to ease. Thank you, Elder Edmund. I did not expect such consideration, given everything that has unfolded these past few days. Your king fought for you today, Edmund said simply, glancing briefly toward Cain before returning his attention to Ren. Whatever doubts existed among the council regarding this matter, that alone has settled most of them far more effectively than any argument could have managed. As the crowd slowly began dispersing back toward the closing ceremonies still scheduled for that evening, Cain remained beside Ren, his hand finding hers once more, steadier now than it had been the previous night, carrying the quiet confidence of a battle fought and won, not simply for pride, but for something far more meaningful than political standing alone. This is not yet finished, Cain said quietly, watching as Edmund moved away to confer with the other elders regarding the promised review of her family's history. But it is, I believe, the turning point we needed. Ren said nothing, but she squeezed his hand gently in response, and for the first time since that first night in the healer's den weeks ago, she allowed herself to believe fully, without reservation, that whatever future awaited them beyond this gathering might finally be one built on something stronger than fear. The closing ceremonies began at dusk. The great hall transformed once more for celebration. Long tables cleared away to make room for the formal gathering of every delegation present within the fortress. Candles lined the stone walls in greater number than usual, their combined light casting a warm glow across banners representing each territory that had traveled to attend, and the air carried a different quality than it had during the tense proceedings earlier in the day, something lighter, charged with anticipation rather than uncertainty. Ren stood near the edge of the hall, dressed simply but carefully in clothing Alira had insisted upon providing for the occasion. Her hair once again left loose and unveiled, though this time the absence of concealment felt less like exposure and more like the natural culmination of everything that had unfolded across the past several days. Alira stood beside her, offering quiet encouragement, as the hall continued filling with delegates and warriors, gathering for what everyone present understood would be a significant announcement. Cain entered the hall from the private chamber where he had spent the afternoon recovering from the physical demands of the challenge, his bruised jaw the only visible reminder of the battle that had settled the question of his judgment beyond further dispute. He wore formal attire befitting his position, though his eyes found Ren immediately across the crowded hall, the same steady certainty she had witnessed throughout the past several days, still burning clearly in his gaze. Edmund called the gathering to order once the hall had filled completely, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd despite its age-worn quality. Before this gathering concludes, our king has requested the opportunity to make a formal announcement, one that concerns matters settled earlier today through the ancient rite, and matters that concern the future of this territory moving forward. The hall quieted immediately, every eye turning toward Cain as he stepped forward to stand before the assembled delegations, his posture carrying the quiet authority that had guided the Northern Territory successfully for years, tempered now with something warmer that had not been present in his public bearing before this gathering began. Many of you witnessed the challenge settled in the courtyard earlier today, Cain began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. A challenge invoked over the question of my judgment regarding a healer named Ren, whose skill saved my life weeks ago following battle against a hostile pack, and whose presence since that night my wolf has recognized, fully and without reservation, as my mate. Murmurs rippled briefly through the crowd, though nothing approaching the tension that had marked Garrick's earlier accusations, the outcome of the challenge having already settled most lingering doubt among those gathered. I have been informed, Cain continued, that Ren's family carries a mark of disgrace placed upon them generations ago, following an accusation against her grandfather that was never conclusively proven. I have reviewed the original records myself in recent days, and I believe, along with several elders who have examined the same evidence, that the judgment placed upon her family was insufficient and unjust, sustained across generations not through proof, but through unquestioned tradition alone. He paused, his gaze finding Ren directly across the hall, warmth settling into his expression despite the formal weight of the announcement he continued to deliver. It is my intention, with the council's support, to formally restore her family's name and honor, recognizing that whatever shadow followed them for generations was never justly earned. And it is further my intention, before this gathering and every delegation present, to acknowledge Ren not simply as my mate, but as the future queen of this territory. The hall fell into a moment of suspended silence before erupting into a mixture of reactions, some delegates murmuring in surprise, others nodding with the particular satisfaction of witnessing tradition give way to something they recognized as genuinely earned rather than simply granted through political convenience. Garrick, seated among his delegation, said nothing, his expression carefully neutral despite whatever bitterness he still carried from his earlier defeat. Cain crossed the hall directly, closing the distance between himself and Ren while every eye in the great hall followed his path, and stopped before her, extending his hand exactly as he had the previous night, though this time the gesture carried the full weight of public acknowledgement rather than private hope alone. I asked you once before to allow me the chance to prove that whatever shadow followed your family did not have to define what grew between us, Cain said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearest them to hear, though the words felt intimate despite the crowded hall surrounding them. I am asking again now, before everyone gathered here, whether you will allow me the honor of standing beside you, not in secret, not hidden behind veils or silence, but openly, as my equal and my queen. Ren looked at his extended hand for a long moment, memories of that first night in the healer's den flooding through her mind alongside every fear and doubt that had shadowed the weeks since. The careful walls she had built around herself for years, the shame she had carried that was never truly hers to bear, and the quiet, steady certainty that had grown between them despite every obstacle placed in their path. She reached out and placed her hand in his, finally, fully, without hesitation. I will, she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for those nearest them to hear, steady despite the tears gathering at the edges of her eyes. Not because tradition demands it, or because the council has finally seen reason, but because my wolf recognized yours in that healer's den weeks ago, in the darkness, before either of us understood what that recognition meant. I have spent my entire life believing I was meant to remain hidden. I do not intend to spend whatever time remains ahead of me continuing to believe that. The hall erupted into genuine celebration at that, delegates and warriors alike raising their voices in approval, the formal weight of the earlier announcement giving way to something closer to joyful acknowledgement, as word spread through the crowd that their king had found his mate, and that mate had finally accepted her place beside him openly, without further concealment. Cain drew her closer, his free hand rising to gently brush aside a strand of hair that had fallen across her face. The same gentle care he had shown weeks ago tending his own wounds now returned in full measure. You once told me you did not know how to trust that this would not end badly, he said quietly. His voice meant only for her despite the celebration continuing around them. I hope, standing here now, that I have begun to prove otherwise. You have, Ren said softly, her free hand resting lightly against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm, the same heart she had listened to through a long night of careful tending weeks ago, when neither of them yet understood what fate had already decided for them both. Though I suspect proving it fully will take considerably longer than a single gathering, however dramatic its conclusion. Then I intend to spend however long that requires, Cain said, a faint smile finally breaking through the formal composure he had maintained throughout the evening's announcement, proving it, day after day, for as long as you will allow me the chance. Illyra approached them a moment later, her expression carrying the particular warmth of someone who had watched over Ren since childhood and now witnessed something she had perhaps feared she would never see. Your grandmother would have been proud, she said quietly, resting a gentle hand on Ren's shoulder. She always believed, despite everything, that your family's name deserved better than the shadow it was forced to carry. I only wish she had lived to see this day arrive. Ren felt fresh tears threatening at that, though these carried nothing of the fear or shame that had haunted her for years, only quiet gratitude for a path that had finally led somewhere worth the difficulty required to walk it. Thank you, Illyra, for everything, for training me, for protecting my secret when it mattered most, and for pushing me toward honesty when I most needed to hear it. Edmund joined them as well, offering formal acknowledgement that carried genuine respect rather than mere political courtesy. The council will convene formally within the coming weeks to address the review of your family's history properly, he said. Given today's events, and given what I have observed of your character throughout this gathering, I do not believe you will find the process nearly as difficult as you might have feared even a few days ago. As the celebration continued through the evening, delegates offering formal congratulations, and the assembled crowd settling into genuine festivity rather than the tense uncertainty that had marked earlier proceedings, Cain and Ren found a quiet moment near one of the tall windows overlooking the mountain grounds below, the celebration continuing softly behind them while they stood together watching the last light of evening fade beyond the distant peaks. Do you remember, Ren said quietly, that first night, when you asked if you would know my name and I told you it was not permitted? I remember, Cain said, his arm settling gently around her shoulders as they stood together at the window. I remember thinking, even through the pain and exhaustion of that night, that something about your voice felt like it mattered more than it reasonably should have, given we had only just met. My wolf recognized yours immediately, Ren admitted. The moment I first touched your wound, before you had even fully opened your eyes, I told myself it meant nothing, that it could not possibly mean what I feared it did, because someone like me was never meant for someone like you. You were exactly meant for someone like me, Kane said firmly, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying none of the formal composure he had maintained throughout the evening's public announcement. Only quiet certainty meant solely for her. Whatever shadow your family's history carried, my wolf saw past it from the very beginning, recognizing something far more important than generations of unproven accusation and unjust punishment. Ren leaned into him then, resting her head against his shoulder as they continued watching the darkening mountains beyond the window, the celebration behind them continuing its warm, joyful murmur, the weight of years of hidden fear finally beginning to lift from her shoulders entirely. I never saw your face that first night, Kane murmured after a long, comfortable silence had settled between them. Not clearly, not through the pain and exhaustion clouding my vision. But my wolf never forgot you, not for a single moment since. Every restless hour, every unanswered question these past weeks, all of it led back to this moment, standing here with you, finally, fully, without anything left hidden between us. Nothing hidden, Ren agreed softly, lifting her head to meet his gaze directly. The veil that had once separated them now nothing more than a distant memory of fear finally overcome. Only this, only us, exactly as we are. Kane leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished, though she did not, and their lips met gently beneath the fading evening light, sealing a promise that had begun weeks ago in the quiet darkness of a healer's den, completed now in the warm glow of a celebration that marked not simply the end of a gathering, but the true beginning of everything still ahead of them. Behind them, the great hall continued its celebration long into the night, delegates and warriors alike raising their voices in genuine joy for a king who had found his mate, and a healer who had finally found the courage to step into the light, after years spent believing she belonged only to the shadows. Word would spread across every allied territory in the days that followed, carrying news not simply of a king's mate discovered, but of an ancient injustice finally set right, of a family's honor restored after generations of undeserved shame. And somewhere beneath the formal celebration and political significance of everything that had unfolded across those few remarkable days, a simpler truth remained, steady and unshakable as the mountain peaks surrounding the fortress walls. A wolf that had never seen her face in the darkness of that first night had recognized her anyway, completely and without doubt, and had refused, through every obstacle placed before them, to ever let that recognition fade. She had cleaned his wounds in darkness, unseen and unnamed. He had spent weeks searching for her without rest, and in the end, fate had brought them together exactly as it always intended, proving that some connections run far deeper than tradition, than fear, than generations of shadow and shame, deep enough that no darkness, however long it lasted, could ever truly keep two recognized hearts apart.